Into the Enchanted Forest. Book 1 of the Enchanted Forest series, written by Alicia J. Chumney. Chapter 6. The last thing either of them expected to appear out of nowhere was a tower. Easily over 70 feet tall, the base was wider than the path, and a hedge of briar thorns circled the smooth stones. Always briars, Gabby mumbled, wondering idly how many tales used thorn bushes as a deterrent. Without a second thought, Jack shouted, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." Shaking her head, Gabby snorted when nothing happened. "You are too late, Ethan." Pointing out their thorny obstacle, she reminded him. The witch cast the thorns after cutting off Rapunzel's hair. She then used the hair to trap and blind the prince. Jack laughed. "My fair princess, no witch except Rapunzel herself cast the briar thorn hedge. In fact, she was the one who tricked the witch before pushing her over the balcony and into the thorns." Gabby turned to face him. "What? No happily ever after?" "The prince was the one who cut her hair." Looking up at the tower, blocking their path, Gabby thought about the changes to all the fairy tales that Ethan had told her. Nothing ever was as it appeared to be, and that seemed to be the lesson that the forest was attempting to make certain she learned. "Well, we still have to get around this tower, somehow," she remarked, while looking around the base for a clue. A faint trail appeared, and waving towards him, she started down the path. Jack, because he was acting more like Jack than he was acting like a friend at the moment, didn't notice the darkening skies until it was too late. Maybe it was the trees or the tower blocking him from clearly seeing the storm clouds brewing. Maybe he was angry with himself for his growing feelings for Gabby. He had tried to ignore them in college as he watched her around her friends, magically manipulated potential suitors from her path, and tried to ignore his growing fascination with her smile. Tried and failed. Not that he could ever let her know that. She was Wonderland royalty and destined to become a queen, and he was Jack Huntsman and destined to guard her and the kingdoms. It was not in the stars. Gabby hesitated. "Are those storm clouds approaching?" She looked up toward the sky as she noticed that everything around them started to darken. Looking up, he shouted, "Run!" just as the skies opened up, dousing them with a cold, wet stream of rain that made it nearly impossible for them to see the granny's cottage ahead. Nearly impossible. It was almost as if the forest wanted them to see the cottage and take refuge within its walls. Running into Rapunzel's tower and discovering the faint trail had not been an accident. Running inside and trying not to slide across the floors, Jack saw Seafoam disappear into a small stable. She wouldn't be able to fit through the cottage door, before closing the door against the storm. "All we need is some light, and then I'll start a fire," Gabby stated as he listened to Gabby's teeth chattering as the cold started to make itself felt. "That will not be necessary," a voice coldly stated behind Jack, before hitting him in the back of the head with a book and pouncing on Gabby before Jack could even fall to the floor. Within moments, Gabby found herself bound to a chair as the cloaked figure stroked the fire. Unable to move, she watched him drag Ethan down the cellar stairs and into the darkness below, leaving her alone on the main floor of the building. "If this is a quest," she whispered to the walls around her, "then it better be my last one, because I have no intention of becoming somebody's meal." She could recognize the basic bones of a tale without having to think about it. She suspected that it was bound to happen the moment they landed in the Enchanted Forest. She still wore the red cloak around her body, the material that had helped keep the rough rope from cutting into her arms where the man had secured her to the chair. Gabby suspected that he was originally a huntsman. His cloak matched the one that Jack wore. What he was now was a mystery. Jack opened his eyes and groaned as he felt the pounding in his head and the knot on the back of it. "They should take my huntsman cloak away from me for letting that monster knock me out." Listening to the air around him, he expected to hear Gabby's breathing. Maybe she was still knocked unconscious. She had to be in the cellar with him. It was unthinkable that the princess could be anywhere else. "Gabby?" Feeling around the floor, he found a chair that was wrapped in a rope and something he wished he could not identify. Next was the stack of crates against the wall. This helped him up where his head found himself lost in a sea of cloaks that were hanging from the rafters. Holding his breath, he carefully felt around them, hoping that it was nothing but cloaks hanging around, hoping it was not like the skeleton he had found still tied to the chair. Slowly, carefully, he started to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 25, 26, 27. Finally, he found the stairs and the cellar door. Without thinking about it, he started pounding on the door in an attempt to breaking it down. He had to save Gabby. Gabby stared at the rattling cellar door behind the odd hybrid of wolf and huntsman. What was that creature? Furry ears and a human face that was shaped like a furless snout? Human hands that ended in claws? Human calves that looked like the hind legs of a werewolf? Was he a wolf huntsman? Wolfman? Were-huntsman? The bigger question was, were there more like him? The potential answer terrified her. Princess, he snarled, your bodyguard cannot protect you this time. The door behind him continued to shake, but the wooden bar across the frame prevented the door from opening. And if your pet dragon comes in, she will destroy this entire place. A growl was heard from a window. Pretending to be unruffled, Gabby gawked at him straight on while she summoned the courage to ask, Who are you? What do you mean? What am I? Do you not mean, what am I? Shrugging her shoulders to the best of her ability, she countered with, Does it matter? Chuckling his growly laugh, he moved to stand in front of her. Not really. I am Howard. I was the weakest of my fellow huntsmen, but as the second son of a minor nobleman, I had little choice in the matter of careers. Shaking his head as he paused, he waited long enough to see if the princess would make any comments. Hearing nothing, he continued, One night I was on guard duty when a wolf attacked me. For some reason, I became this. Was it a full moon? Gabby whispered the question, slipping out before she could stop it. Allowing his tone to reveal that he was impressed with her question, he grinned before answering her. Yes, it was. Gabby searched her mind for werewolf lore. The Harringtons had taught her so many things as they read her fairy tales and helped develop a love of reading. She had read books on so many different mythologies and fantasy stories. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, she had to have the knowledge needed to defeat this menace. Pacing back and forth, Howard rambled. It wasn't often he had a captive audience of a royal nature. Even if she was one of Red Riding Hood's distant relatives, she was still a useless princess. I have plans for your huntsman, he snarled. He'll taste even better than the red-hooded girls. They were young and still had some of their baby fat, but he's more muscle than fat. He'll be enough to fill my freezer for weeks. Silver, Gabby remembered. Silver killed werewolves. Unfortunately, she didn't have access to any guns or silver bullets. Scanning the room, she found nothing. He had planned his house carefully. There were no decorations. She was tied to one of the two chairs in the room. The couch was faded and threadbare. The rugs scattered around the room had disturbing rust stains on the fibers. Huntsmen are the worst. Everybody told me that I would bulk up as I got older, even my father. He was a lumberjack. Howard smirked. My older brother was one too. They both thought that studying to be a huntsman would be a good career path. Nobody else told me that the other huntsmen were bullies. He conveniently let out all the things he had done to the other student huntsmen in his class, stealing all of one classmate's clothes when the other man was in the shower had resulted in his head getting dunked in the toilet. Another classmate had been allergic to mushrooms, and Howard had made certain to switch plates whenever something with mushrooms was served. His classmates had not let that offense go, and it was pure luck the classmate wasn't deathly allergic, even though he suffered greatly from the consumption of mushrooms. They didn't know I was coming that night, Howard smirked. That was my first taste of human flesh. He still didn't look at Gabby, but stared at the door Ethan Jack inefficiently did his fist. Gabby refocused her attention on Howard and the knots tying her to the chair. She didn't know much about tying and untying rope, but she could feel the loops and trace the tips of her fingers through the knot, hoping to discover how to loosen up her bonds. She reasoned that, at the very least, she could attempt to knock him out with her chair before releasing Ethan and getting him to handle the creature in front of her. "What about the Red Riding Hoods?" she asked, trying to reclaim his attention before he decided to do something to Ethan in front of her. His laugh sounded more like a bark. "You've heard of the original story." "Yes." "Turns out the wolf wasn't evil. He never ate the grandmother. They lured him into the cottage." He trailed off, looking around the room. "In fact, they lured him into this cottage. You are standing in a historical landmark." Ethan Jack, hearing Howard's words, stopped banging on the door. "So I started luring the Red Riding Hoods here. Nobody really has figured out that those girls are responsible for countless meaningless werewolf and wolf deaths. They claim to be—" He trailed off as he tried to figure out how to explain the organization to Gabby. "Like your Girl Scouts." They couldn't know it, but Ethan Jack had turned around and had looked at all the Red Hoods hanging in the basement around him. So many girls had gone missing whose only goal was environmental awareness. Gabby's fist tightened. She didn't want to ask, but felt as if she needed to, even though she already knew the answer. "What did you do to them?" Howard smiled, the look sinister with his jagged yellow teeth. He glanced over at the giant oven that took up most of the space in the kitchen area. "The funny thing about living in a fairy tale world is that sometimes the idea comes to you. If you heat something up high enough, it turns into ash, and nobody can find it." "You cooked them," Gabby whispered. With renewed energy, she got back to working at the knots, keeping her tied to the chair. "Gingerbread witch style," Howard smirked. "I'm sure you will fit in my oven as well." "People are expecting me," Gabby pointed out. "Questing royals go missing all the time," he countered. She didn't want to argue that they didn't. The enchanted forest protected its questing royals from death. Instead, she wisely said nothing. Once again chuckling, Howard started to reveal his plans. There was nothing for him to worry about at this point. The princess was tied to a chair, and her protector was locked in the basement with his food source. On second thought, "You, my princess, I shall eat raw. I will make your dragon and huntsman watch while I tear out your heart." All Howard heard was Ethan Jack rattling the door by throwing his entire body weight against the wood. One moment Gabby was sitting down, and then the next she had thrust a silver dinner knife into his heart. She didn't have a clue where it came from or how her hands had gotten free when she'd barely made any progress on untying herself. All Gabby knew was one moment she was sitting, and the next she was covered in blood. Backing away, she started sobbing as Howard collapsed onto the wooden planks in front of her, staring motionless at the silver knife sticking out of his chest. Gabby remained standing there sobbing, staring, and shaking until Ethan's shouting called her attention. Somehow he had managed to break down the door and escape the cellar. When saying her name in normal tones did nothing to rouse her from a stunned stupor, he started getting louder and louder until it worked. "I thought he'd—" Ethan whispered as he hugged her tightly, leading her towards the outside door. "It was you or him, and we need you more than somebody who has killed at least 20 red-hooded girls." She did not need to know that he was downplaying the number of red hoods that were in that cellar. "How," she hiccuped, "do you know that?" "He kept the cloaks as trophies hanging around in the cellar." Once again, he downplayed his discoveries. It was the wrong thing to say as Gabby started sobbing harder than before. Carrying her the rest of the way outside, he walked several yards into the woods until the house vanished from sight. It was a risky move to leave the path, but all Ethan could think was that he needed to get her away from that house. As she started to retch into the bushes, losing all of the meager breakfast they had eaten that morning, Ethan stroked her hair back and tried his best to comfort her. Right then, at that very moment, he was more her friend than he was her bodyguard. Pulling her towards him, Ethan did the only thing he could think of doing. The only thing he'd been thinking about doing for hours since they escaped Granny's cottage. Pushing stray strands of hair from her face, he leaned down and kissed her. He had waited until she had calmed down, resisting the urge he felt knowing it could scare her. Going slowly, he gave Gabby the chance to pull away from him, and was surprised when she bridged the gap between the two of them. Her boldness caused him to freeze up for a moment before pressing his lips against hers, thought asking, her mouth opened, inviting him in, and not letting him back away from the kiss. "About time!" Seafoam huffed before noisily clomping back into the bushes. Pulling apart, Gabby leaned her head against his chest as she tried to calm down her breathing. "Seriously, though, Ethan." Closing her eyes, she replayed the scene in her head a little bit longer, wreaking havoc on her attempts to get her breathing and heartbeat back under control. Taking a step backward and breaking their connection, Jack began apologizing. "I'm so sorry, Princess. I overstepped my bounds." Looking up at him, she wondered what she was going to say to him. Instead, she started marching forward. She'd leave her thoughts in her head for a while longer until she had some coherent statement about how his sense of duty was misplaced sometimes.